Hi. Yesterday we did a row of weaving and included all of the braids onto the blue side of our copper shield shape in order to be prepared for bringing a warp over and increasing the narrowing of that shape. So we'll now move over a warp on this particular row. So I've demonstrated this before a few videos back, and so I'm not going to talk through it. What I'm going to do is read an essay that I wrote. I was honored to write about knowing Mr. Bill Holm, and they were going to publish the 50th anniversary of the iconic, important book of the the analysis of form that he wrote many, many years ago, and that has had many reprints. But this was going to be a special reprint with the 50th anniversary of that book to press. So I was, like I said, honored to be asked to write an essay within this book. So many, many people have this book and different editions of the book. So you might not have the newest, the 50th anniversary. So I'm going to share my essay with you as I'm demonstrating. So I'll narrate that essay over my demonstrations today. So thank you so much for joining me, and Hawa. Like I said, I'm going to be reading from the book Northwest Coast Indian Art, an Analysis of Form by Bill Holm, and this is in the 50th anniversary edition, and it's under the section Artists' Reflections. So here's my essay. The designs of the Nahin are bounded by both the pentagonal format and the horizontal and vertical warps and wefts used to create a chief's row. The unique angled ovoids and U-shaped forms are a dialectal variant of the visual language of the Northwest Coast, which has been studied and defined by Bill Holm in his groundbreaking book, Northwest Coast Indian Art, an Analysis of Form. Reading this influential book, I was better able to comprehend the designs that stretched and filled the textile matrix of the Nahin. In the early 1970s, when I was just still in university, I was bold enough during a visit to the University of Washington to go to Bill Holm's office and introduce myself as the granddaughter of Selina Paratovich, a Haida weaver known to Bill. Offered that preface, he was kind enough to give me his time. I had studied his book and used it for a book review assignment in my art history course at Western Washington University in Bellingham, and I was elated to meet the author of the book that I knew was in the libraries of all Northwest Coast carvers and artists. It wasn't until the late 1990s, as I transformed from a painter to a weaver, that the concepts discussed in that influential book, as well as its respected author, would affect my own art. When I received my first commission for a full-size robe, it was for a replication of a robe exhibited in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. An image of the robe appeared in the book From the Land of the Totem Poles, the Northwest Coast Indian Art Collection at the American Museum of Natural History, by Aldona Honaitis. But I traveled to New York City in order to examine the robe itself, which I was able to do for only one day. The robe was behind glass, and I studied it for hours. I measured it, I counted the warps that showed through the worn sea otter fur. I estimated the warp size. It was exquisite, with its fine mountain goat wool wefts and its soft aged hues. I was overwhelmed, near, yet unable to touch or photograph it, or turn it around to see its technique revealing back. I knew that taking detailed notes was essential, so I reached into my purse for a paper on which to write. I often joked about my purse being a black hole. Material entered it, never to be found again. But there, at the museum, I pulled out a sheet of paper, folded in quarters, that when unfolded, revealed a photocopy of the robe before me. It was serendipitous. I had no idea how or when that image was placed in my purse. To me, it was a sign from the universe that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. Any doubt I may have had was gone. The robe I was about to begin making was meant to be, and it would be my guide. After that day of study in New York, I returned home with my notes and a few poor photographs showing fuzzy details through reflected glare. 200 years ago, a Naheen robe weaver would have been given a painted cedar pattern board along with the request to weave this important and powerful chief's garment. I expressed my dilemma to the collectors who had commissioned the Naheen robe replication, and shortly afterward I received a large paper pattern from them. It was huge, not in proportion to the original robe in New York. I called to thank them, but also to say I could not use it. As a novice robe creator, I did not feel I could deviate from the proportions of the original as I created the replication. My sister Holly Churchill was visiting me at my home near Seattle when I told her about my need for an at-scale pattern design for the robe. She immediately thought of Bill Holm, with whom she had become friends while he was in Ketchikan teaching a carving class at the Totem Heritage Center, where she also teaches. He had carved a wooden hat form in exchange for her teaching him a weaving technique. We went to his home, and she told him about my problem. He turned to his vast home library and found a book with the robe's image. Appraising the problem, he asked us if we could leave him for a while and return in a few hours, and so we did. Within that short amount of time, he had scanned the book image, calculated the proportions, and printed multiple 8.5 by 11-inch sheets, which he had taped together to form an at-scale paper pattern board. I was thrilled and so thankful for such an esteemed man's assistance. It was another sign that I was on the right path. I used that paper pattern board for 2.5 years, and it became well worn. It traveled with me to the various places where I demonstrated weaving. I loved to point out my pattern board and tell people how Bill Holm had helped me. When the robe was finished, it was brought out at a feast at the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center in Seattle. It is customary to acknowledge everyone who takes part in creating a robe, and of course, Bill Holm's contribution was acknowledged. He was out of the country at that time, however, and unable to attend. Later, I brought the completed robe to his home so he could see what I had done while following his paper pattern board. He complimented me, but he added that he initially had had doubts that my replication of the complex chief's robe would be completed. He had not been aware that I felt the robe was a willing guide, and that his creating my pattern board had also been a sign that my weaving the robe and completing it was sanctioned by mystical providence. Many years later, during a slide presentation of my Naheen weaving at the Burke Museum, I was able to acknowledge again Bill as an early inspiration for completing that first robe. Bill and his wife Marty were in attendance, and I was glad of the opportunity to not only thank him again for inspiring me, but also thank him for his influence on weavings as a result of his research into the Northwest Coast art and textiles. Dorica Jackson and Cheryl Samuel had shared with me their account of how Bill Holm had, through his professorship at the University of Washington, helped them and other weavers advanced their knowledge of the history and techniques of the Nahin. Cheryl went on to further research the early mountain goat wool weaving of the northern Northwest coast, and this research culminated in the current revival of ancient techniques used in Ravenstail weaving. Cheryl also went on to teach my mother, Dolores Churchill, Nahin and Ravenstail weaving. Both of these women were my mentors, and they taught me the Northwest Coast textiles. My sister Holly also benefited by Bill's willingness to share his research. From his work, she learned about cedar bark clothing, and now she shares that knowledge with students in her classes and workshops. A 1982 article published in the American Indian Art Magazine, "A Woolly Mantle Neatly Wrought, the Early Historic Record of Northwest Coast Pattern Twine Textiles, 1774 through 1850, by Bill Holm, broadened my interest in the pre-contact cultural use of mountain goat wool textiles, and I began my quest into that history because of Bill Holm's published works and personal friendships. The traditional formline art, weaving, and history are better understood by collectors, artists, weavers, and students of the cultures of the Pacific Northwest Coast." Howa, Bill.